Greylock, a secret project that used supernatural powers to protect the country. It sounded perfect, but little did they knew what was coming. In this video, we will do a deep dive into the most terrifying analog horror and answer the haunting question, what is going on? And I'm Sir Chris. I explore the internet and I make videos about it. A special thanks to our Patreon supporter Pawn, and let's go. Our mystery begins in Back Online. It shows us various angles of Simyodyne USA offices, which were abandoned after being closed in an emergency. Without much being said, the invader continues to breach the system to extract and discover more about the facility's disturbing past. He tries to access the camera files, but ends up receiving a fatal error in a specific one, the morgue camera. Which further ahead, this camera is known for capturing paranormal events. But let's slow down. The next tape begins with someone driving a car while a radio broadcast is passing in the background that talks about the Bible. But in that same broadcast, one phrase ends up standing out.
Are not to enter the thicket in search of the lion. We may pay dear.
Until he finally arrives at his destination, a mountain on which it had excavation equipment. The unknown driver enters and starts wandering through the forest as if he was looking for something. And it's from here that things start to get interesting. In the middle of the video, two views of different areas of the mountain appear. The first shows us a mountain without snow, and another with snow, but now with bloodstains, while we can hear the following phrases in the background. The hikers were shocked and horrified when they came across what they first believed to be the mangled carcass of an animal. But when the hikers witnessed a human skull, they hurried to call authorities. The two men who wish to remain anonymous say that they've hiked the Mount Greylock trails for over a decade. Mount Greylock, a mountain in Massachusetts, which is known to hold a frightening secret. And the tape ends with the driver being chased, while the radio says the following chilling phrase. The third is called Orientation Protocols, and it starts with a warning, saying that the tape we are about to watch was for a man called Alexander Michael Marsh, which had been made by Simyodyne on January 2nd of 1993, which makes it one of the most recent tapes we have. That same tape tells us about a secret US Army project in partnership with Simyodyne, called Project Stargate, which coincidentally has the name of a declassified project that actually existed. The project was to study and acquire the ability to receive information through impossible methods, like a kind of sixth sense, but they eventually gave up on it because it was not effective. But in Greylock, it was a project created to make thought forms, or better known as tulpas, the manifestation of accumulated energy and thoughts, which ends up creating a supernatural entity, that, if enough energy is put into it, it ends up getting a permanent body. With this, Unit 13 assumes that with the existence of thought forms, this makes them think that ghosts are actually thought forms that were created unintentionally by families who are grieving someone's death. And with that comes the intention behind this project. Create tulpas to protect the nation of the United States through the thought form manifester, in which this project will be managed by a well-known psychologist, Dr. Bernard Ace. But as promising as it is, this experiment brings its own consequences. Along with a big list of side effects, the tulpas have the chance to look like something normal or like something seen in a nightmare, even though they were docile. Here, we realize that the guinea pigs had to watch 3 videos in total before using the machine. But the chaos begins on the 4th tape. It begins with a view of a stalker outside a house as he sees the man turning off the lights and heading upstairs. With the coast clear, he approaches the house, removes the protective screen from one of the windows, and thus enters the house, in which we realize that the invader waited for the perfect moment to kill the house owner. Which then shows us an announcement for the premiere of Max Headroom, which is interrupted by the emergency broadcast system at the request of the Massachusetts police. At 3 AM, the police confirms the presence of a malicious group of armed home invaders that already broke in 49 houses in just one day. And with that, they asked residents to remain at home with everything locked while the police reinforce their measures and continue to investigate. The tape ends with someone not doing what they suggested, and so he suffers the consequences. If we search for the date of when the premiere of Max Headroom took place, that gives us the date March 31st of 1987. Which means that in March 29th was when the invasions began, and on March 30th, the emergency broadcast was activated. The fifth tape is called Not Here, Not Now, Not Anymore, and it only adds more fuel to the fire. It starts with Tiffany Crisaldi, who went for an ultrasound at the clinic. Everything was going well, until eventually her baby disappears with a snap of a finger. Discreetly, in one of the frames, a title from a newspaper appears. Bizarre events leave Berkshires in terror. Without believing, the nurse leaves to change the machine, in which in a conversation with another doctor, we come to the disturbing conclusion that she really lost the baby. And this tape ends with the following description. Do you know what they did up there? These are the consequences. The sixth tape begins with a speech from Dr. Bernard Ace on October 4th of 1981. His speech talks about how humanity has fought and survived against various challenges and circumstances. While inspiring, it quickly takes a dark turn. After the speech, the invader sees the history of messages that Frank Porter had received from Paul Morelli. Frank had hired Paul's company to build Unit 13's headquarters in Mount Greylock. In just 6 days, he receives 9 messages which tell the downfall of Paul's team. Since this is a deep dive, I will briefly explain all of the messages. The first message talks about the beginning of the excavation, where the team finds several ancient tunnels. But as the entrance caved in, they had to bust through, which they soon regretted it. In the next day, Paul says that several members of the team got sick, and now, strangely, the tunnels had lights. There is someone else with the team on that mountain, and several team members report being watched by an entity in the darkness of the forest. The third message says that the man Frank sent to enter and take photos became super sick after leaving the tunnels, to the point where the team had to drag him to his car, and Paul receives the news of what was inside of the tunnel. And with that, Paul sends Arnold Rivers to speak directly to Frank, since he was an archaeologist. On the 4th, Paul begins seeing the entity that the team was talking about, and the team became more sick. On the 5th, Paul says that their food suddenly rotted, even though the equipment was working properly. On the 6th, the entire team is disturbed, to the point that Frank's employees set up hunting cameras. And sure enough, on that same night, the camera catches motion at 12:38 AM. But nothing appears on the camera, yet. When trying to access the 7th message, another camera captures the movement of a fog. In the 8th, in a desperate attempt, Paul leaves a message to Frank because the team is sick, to the point where some of them are quote-unquote dead. And strangely, no matter how much he called the emergency services, none of them worked, except Frank's. At this point, I have to admit that the guy who made Paul's voice is very talented. You can really hear the desperation on his voice.
I figured the phones were f***ed up, but the machine actually picked up.
And sadly, Paul loses his mind and enters the tunnels. And the messages end with the painful screams of Paul, who is tortured and used in a ritual inside of the tunnels. Honestly, I'm torn as to whether Frank is good or evil, because he didn't hesitate to help Paul, but at the same time, he told him that if anything strange happens, which he did, to call him. He definitely knew something that they didn't. The 7th tape, Back to Normal, updates us on the events we saw in the 4th tape. In it, the authorities state that the group that has been tormenting the cities was part of an anti-American militia, and with the continued efforts of the police, everything will return to normal. Now, one of these statements is a lie. I will let you decide it by yourself. But in the middle of a phrase, a hijack happens, in which they call the presenter Don Wright a liar. And before it ends, in the last frames, 2 important pieces of information appear. A photo of a couple with the names Alexander Marsh and Tiffany Crisaldi. This means that the subconscious tape had been made for the supposed father who lost his wife and his son. And for last, a powerful newspaper. These events are only the tip of the iceberg, says Jim Milgren, a former police officer who now works as a private investigator. There are horrifying reports of people, healthy grown adults, becoming deformed, growing extra limbs, developing several mental conditions, or even sicknesses. The 8th tape is the follow-up of the show after the hijack, that quickly cuts to the discussion of 3 individuals, the GBS executor and the program's 2 producers. Alan is obviously angry with what happened, since that program was the most watched on the station, and now they immediately needed Don Wright, the presenter, to come to the studio to read the statement and thus calm the audience. But there is a problem. Since Don Wright left the studio, he hasn't answered calls or responded to messages, which forces Alan to tell Liam to go to Don's house. Halfway through, the discussion file is deleted, and in front of our eyes, an unknown file is added, one of the most important ones we have for now. The file shows us the audio recordings of Arnold Eugene Reavers, the only survivor of the Mount Greylock incident, and the man sent by Paul to explain what he saw inside the tunnels to Frank. He was recording the audios 13 days later because he believed his life was in danger. Inside the mountain tunnels, Arnold and the team end up discovering artifacts from hundreds of ancient tribes, making those tunnels 11,000 years old. His overwhelming joy quickly changed to pure dread as he questions himself the reason why the mountain was so important. Things only get worse. Further in, they noticed that the tunnels were connected to several chambers, which were used for human and animal sacrifices, and even rooms used to store offerings to an evil entity. And upon leaving the tunnel, his health worsened, to the point that he left the project, but one question remained with him.
Would the government really send someone to kill me over this?
Interesting. And sure enough, someone breaks into his house, and he quickly hides in the wardrobe and says that whatever happens to him, give the audios and the cameras to Jim Milgren. And Arnold dies. Jim Milgren is, and will be the most important character in the story, which makes me think that the Semiodyne invader and the unknown driver was actually him. And that explains how the driver knows exactly where the excavation took place. After this, we got to hear Liam Hollander talking with 911, saying that Don Wright is dead after someone broke into his house. Do you remember the footage we saw at the beginning of tape 4? That was actually a member of the cult who waited for the perfect time to kill Don Wright when he least expected it. The 9th tape shows us the beginning of everything. It shows us the playback of a program from 1963 which talked about the Semiodyne program to put technologies in all American households to help the citizens. Because later on, we see that they were actually used to spy on their customers, and even one of them noticed it. And in this analog horror, John F. Kennedy is murdered by an assassin hired by Percival Rothwell, the owner of Semiodyne, because he refused the offer, and because he was afraid that he would reveal the truth. Which then shows us a cult wearing white masks. I didn't told you this, but throughout the tapes, there's a mask that appears several times after important moments, such as the killings, which made me feel like it was the cult mask, the Stargate's cult mask. And this tape ends with a child named Katie being woken up in the middle of the night by her imaginary friend who ends up killing her. Messages from the Dead begins with the vision of Jim Milgren, who finds a dead mouse on the floor in the middle of the forest, which he picks up and at home cuts in half to find a tape with a super important message. But before that, 3 messages appear that were left by Alex March after Tiffany not answering the phone. This, of course, makes Alex worried, to the point that he leaves in the middle of his shift to sadly find her dead. During the interrogation, Alex talks about how devastating it was for them to have lost the baby, with Tiffany being the one who was most affected. Eventually, Alex goes back to work while Tiffany stays at home recovering, but with an agreement to check on one another during every lunch break, until the morning of May 18th of 1987. The next day, an autopsy is carried away on Tiffany's body by Dr. Henry Shalbridge, where he highlights some bizarre points. The corpse had a dark substance coming out of the eyes, mouth, and torso, and she had a strange symbol on her abdomen which had been placed hours after her death, which means that she dies in an unknown way, and whoever killed her waited hours to make that symbol, or after a few hours, he returned back to the corpse to do it. And it will not be the last time we see this symbol. Also, during a hand-rich exterior analysis, paranormal events would happen. The lights would constantly flick, the temperature in the room would drop drastically, and they could hear a woman crying after they had stored the Tiffany's body. Soon after, the tape throws us back in time to the audio of Tiffany's therapy, which leads us to realize that she already suffered from hallucinations since she was 8 years old. With that, the psychologist begins to guide her into a calm hypnotherapy.
I want you to picture yourself standing outside your house in your front yard. It's a beautiful day out with big fluffy clouds and a blue sky. No one else is around.
Which slowly becomes a manipulation.
I'm scared.
Doesn't matter if you're scared. You must open the door.
After guiding Tiffany to her room, she finds something she's never seen before, a black door, which when she opens it, she's scared because of the tall man who noticed her presence and quickly approaches her. Until when she returns, her face quickly appears before and after, which made me think that the tall man finally caught her after 21 years. And finally, we see Jim Milgren listening to the tape he found in the mouse, which shows us the symbol of the cult, who for some reason have located him, contacted him, and want to offer him information. But now why or what, it's still a mystery. The penultimate tape is called Preparations for a Guest, and it shows us a television program that aired at 3 AM called Inside These Walls, which had a sus description. A home renovation project that brings a new spirit to an old basement. I don't like where this is going. It shows us a view of a door, which behind it had a small room. When closing and opening again, the footage begins to be interrupted by some sort of ritual, until the cameraman enters, closes the door, and places a tape player on the floor. When he presses play, we can hear someone crying. Alex is crying, as the audio repeats the phrase, "so lonely." And so we move on to the last tape to date, Waking Your Subconscious, which right from the start, we see that it had been made for Jim Milgren's daughter. And this is the best tape in the series. But before we start, we had to be ready. With a paper and pencil, we move on to write the answers of the sections. The test is divided into sections of 2 chapters that I separated to explain it to you. Planned and Danger. Planned starts with induction, and in it we had to stare at the screen for 30 seconds while a red light flashes several times. In priming, 6 words appear on the screen, and we had to write on the paper the one that doesn't fit the topic. And when we write all of the words, the chapter Danger begins. It starts with the information that the VHS player has detected an anomaly and tells us immediately to stop because it would put our mental health in danger. What we are about to see was not made by a human. Danger starts with conditioning, where in it we will have to do what the text says, be it read the word and not the face, or vice versa, which ends up with a new and bizarre expression, which quickly passes to the camera in Charlotte's Milgren kennel. Charlotte is woken in the middle of the night by the security guard who monitors her security cameras, Troy Erickson, who calls her after seeing the door opening on its own and the lights going out unexpectedly. As she had to be up early the next day, she begs Troy to not call the police, since the last few times everything had been a false alarm. After back and forth, he eventually lets her go in person to see what happened, and they soon see that it was a horrible decision. When viewing the previous alerts, Troy discovers that she had never received a false alarm. All the alarms she received were true, but for some reason, the previous person who called her didn't notice. In the alarm of that night, he sees the entity entering the house, and distressed, Troy tells her to run away while he calls the police. Now, she had to escape the entity for a few minutes, as the police would take at least 3 minutes to arrive at the scene. Until at the last minute, she says one last chilling sentence that gets her killed.
I think my skin is moving.
Where we then see the last 2 sections of the Danger chapter, True or False, and Activation. In True or False, the entity says that the test is changing our mind, choice is an illusion, and that we shouldn't ignore the darkness of our mind as it only makes it stronger, and says to open the black door. The same door that Tiffany opened when she was 8 years old. Thus, opening the black door means that you allow the evil entity to infect your mind, or does that simply allow the tall man to haunt us? Whatever that is, it's not good. And the Activation is a weird compilation of audio and visuals used to make people hallucinate with the thought forms. And at the end, it shows us the police entering the basement to see that now Charlotte has merged with the other 2 dead bodies of her dogs. And it all ends. So, what's going on? I won't say that I know about everything that's going on, especially because this series is still being developed, but I will lay down my cards for you. It all started in 1963, after the death of John F. Kennedy, in which Percival Rothwell and the CIA were involved after the president denied both offers, the NAI program and the Operation Northwoods. In fact, he says that the meeting was a complete fiasco, and Kennedy threatened to expose their real intentions, in which President Johnson takes the lead and accepts the Signal-Din offer because they both had something in common: malicious plans. 1 year later, the psychologist who is part of the cult ends up manipulating Tiffany Crisaldi to open the black door of her mind. In doing so, she ends up being disturbed by the hallucination of the tall man, who eventually causes her death. 2 years later, most American homes now have technologies that are used to spy on them. With the various conspiracies surrounding the assassination of the president, I feel this is where Jim Milgren's radio program began. 11 years later, the government, in this case the cult, began a confidential project called Project Stargate, which had the intention of creating thought forms to cause terror in the city, in which they still used the traditional form that was less effective. And that explains why everything is so slow in the beginning. But over the years, one specific psychologist ends up standing out, Dr. Bernard Hayes, who in a speech in 1981 revealed that they wanted to be more than humans. They wanted to be like God. Everything went quiet for 6 years until 1987. On March 24th, Frank Porter hired the services of Paul Morelli's company to execute the Greylock project, which was to build the Unit 13 headquarters specifically on the Mount Greylock. And if something strange happened, Frank tells Paul to call him. And sure enough, right on the first day, Paul's team ends up finding ancient tunnels under the mountain. As the entrance caved in, they are forced to burst through, in which they find several secrets, and thus sign their death sentence. Remember what I said about Frank maybe being one of the good ones? I'll take it back, because it was all part of his plan. The tunnels were blocked due to the entrance having collapsed, and after Paul's team opening the entrance, the next morning, the team was confused because now the tunnels had lights. Now the cult had access to the mountain, which was used to give offerings to the devil. And coincidentally, after opening the tunnel, several disturbing things happened in and around the mountain. Paul's team ends up becoming infected and turned into abominations. Paul is used in a ritual after entering the tunnel. Bodies fell from the sky in Cheshire, the baby phenomenon, several deaths, including Arnold's, the hijack, the Dawn Wright's homicide, Tiffany's unexpected death, and the disturbing events after her death. But what keeps hope in this hopeless scenario is Jim Milgren. Since he's actually the invader who breaches Simeo Din's computers, he's the one who went in person to the Mount Greylock after the hikers had found a human skull, escaped death, and he himself now knows exactly what happened and is contacted by the cult. But now why? It remains a mystery. And since you watched this deep dive until the end, what about a disturbing ARG to be different this time? I'm thinking in turning this into a series where I deep dive in various topics. If there's something I can improve, or if you want to share your theory, tell me in the comments. Thank you so much, and take care, my friend.